Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining everybody in the audience. I'm Colin Tubner. I'm the director of the Customer Solutions Department at airSlate, which is the department responsible for helping people best understand our products and also become successful with our products. I've been at airSlate for almost 2 years, and before that, I worked at several other workflow automation companies, both on the sales side and on the product management side. And with me, I've got Harry, who I will let introduce himself.
Hey everyone, Harry Radigan, a member of Colin's team. My role at airSlate is solution architect, and I am helping our customers to understand how airSlate can help automate their workflows and hopefully realize the value of the platform. I have a background in low-code application development as well as IT management, so more than happy to give you the demo of what airSlate can do for you today.
Great, thanks, Harry. So just one logistical item. If you have any questions during the call, please put those in the Q&A feature inside of Zoom. You should be able to find that inside your Zoom application. And Harry and I will take a look at those. And if it's something that we can address right away during the presentation or demo, we'll do that. But we will also have time at the end for Q&A. So if we don't answer your question right away, please be patient and we will pick it up at the end of the webinar. So a quick agenda for today. We're going to start just talking about what workflow automation is. Then we'll get into these terms low code and no code workflow automation and the difference. We'll talk about the business benefits from automation and how to think about choosing an automation tool. Then we'll get into Harry's demo of the airSlate product and showing how you can automate workflows. And then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So what's automation all about? You know, sometimes when I get these kinds of, when I do these kinds of presentations, going back 15 years or so, people will say, automation, doesn't that just mean you're trying to fire people? It's definitely not. In fact, there's a number of tasks that people do today in the workplace that really can be automated and that those humans can be freed up to do more value-added tasks. So it's actually the opposite. It's really protecting somebody's job when the work they're doing is more valuable to the business and can't be automated. So some of the things that I'm sure almost every business in the world is doing today that could be more automatic, things like notifications, reminding people that they need to do a particular piece of work, routing documents to the right person, whether that's to a supervisor, to the right person who needs to approve it, transferring data either between documents or between systems, and then integrations with external systems. So having data flow from a document into an integration and then into that external system. Some research that backs up the success rate of automation. So 38% of companies that are doing automation said that workflow automation is the key factor for success. If that sounds low, it's probably because a lot of people are thinking about automation in terms of just data integration and flowing data directly between applications. Sometimes that's all you need to have a successful automation. And other times, workflow and documents are more important. So it really depends on exactly what piece of the business is being automated. And then secondly, among that group, 72% made workflow automation a strategic priority and it has a role in their company's achievements. So obviously there's a lot of people out there, per this McKinsey research, having success with workflow automation. So what is workflow automation? It's really about taking steps that right now involve multiple people handing off pieces of work. That could be documents, it could just be data, and removing those handoffs from being manual, removing some of the work from being manual, and really smoothing out that work, tracking it, making sure that it gets done on time with as few errors as possible. No-code automation solution, that's what airSlate is. It's not the only one out there. But what that means is that there's truly no code that has to be written to automate things. And we'll talk more about low code versus no code versus just building applications in general. But for now, no code really does mean there's no code. The configuration of the automation is done completely by drawing pictures of the process, pointing and clicking and selecting things from menus and those kinds of things. A software robot. This is a term which is relatively new, maybe only 5, 6 years has it been commonplace. And it's not always used quite the same way. So sometimes a software robot is really impersonating people. So it's the software robot is looking at applications on a screen, finding a word, clicking on a button, and that is a approach to integrating to systems that don't have good APIs. An API is an interface for integration that was designed by the people that built the software. airSlate bots are bots that take actions during the workflow. And so they're responsible for both automating things inside the workflow process, as well as automating things where there's integrations to other systems. But airSlate bots don't impersonate humans by pointing and clicking at software. They instead use APIs. So when an airSlate bot interacts with a Google Sheet, for example, it's using the API that was designed by Google as the way that external software can interact with a Google Sheet. The benefit to that is that it's much more stable. As Google Sheets rolls out new features, the way the front of it looks might change. And so if you're a user clicking on things, you might have to click on something different. But the behind the scenes API typically doesn't change. And so our automations keep working. And last one, conditional statement. So while airSlate and other no-code solutions don't require code, they do require you to understand some concepts that are also used in code. And a conditional statement is one of those where you have an if X, where X is some condition, then you do Y, and Y is the action. So a very common one in airSlate is that we look at whether a document has been signed before deciding to perform an integration where we take the data from that document and put it in another system. I mentioned that my history is in this industry and workflow. We used to use the term BPM previously, and now that's really been replaced by low-code and no-code automation platforms. Not all low-code or no-code platforms have really robust workflow. Some of them are more data-oriented, and you're looking at different views of data rather than looking at processes. But this work has evolved a lot over time. In the 2000s, the platforms were typically not low-code or no-code. They typically were designed for programmers to build workflow into their applications. And so it saved you some time, sure, and maybe it made it easier to build workflow in an automated way, but you were still writing code to do that. By the late 2000s and the early 2010s, you started to get these platforms to be more robust, be more graphically oriented, and starting to allow people who weren't developers to work with them, which shortened the time to value and also reduced the cost. But now with airSlate, you can automate your own workflows for as little as $30 a month for a Flow Creator license. And really in a couple of weeks, you can start automating document-based workflows in airSlate. So what does airSlate as a product include? It's a number of different things, and really that's been designed as an important part of what the value is. So aside from the process management and the basic automation of workflows that we've been talking about, there's also a lot of document features. airSlate's legacy as a company is from the e-signature environment and also the PDF editing environment. And so we've built those features into airSlate. So we can generate documents, we track versions of documents as they progress through the workflow, and we allow people to sign those documents all in the same tool without having to integrate multiple tools together. A generated document can even be routed for redlining in a contracts kind of scenario. And then again, that same document will be routed for signature. To all of that, we've added integration too. And we talked about the bots briefly. So airSlate has a library of more than 100 bots, some of which are about automating work inside the documents, but more of which are about copying data and copying documents into and out of external systems. So you could have a flow where you start in Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics as the CRM system. You click a button that sends data from the record you're looking at in Salesforce over to airSlate. airSlate uses that to generate a document. the document is sent to the customer that was indicated on the Salesforce record for e-signature. And then once that document is signed, it comes back to a manager at our company to be countersigned. And so all of that can be very easily automated in just this one tool. So I mentioned we talk about low code versus no code, and what the difference between these is. Unfortunately, in the market, and a lot of analysts are talking about low code / no code tools. I think that's unfortunate. They both have overall the same goal, which is to allow businesses to create their own custom software, custom automation of the business processes. However, the tools are different in what they can do, and they have a different key objective, and I think that's the most important takeaway. So, low-code platforms are really tools that are intended to help developers, people with a software engineering or computer science background, very quickly build apps within a certain domain, which is these business apps. The no-code platforms are designed to expand the audience of who can build the applications. And because there's no coding required, you can have regular users, people who know how to use an Excel spreadsheet, for example, and they can build working automations in airSlate without extensive training, without getting a computer science degree or any of that. There's always going to be a big role for developers writing code. You're not going to use a low-code platform or a no-code platform to build the Google search engine or a 3D video game. But for a vast majority of custom business applications, these platforms can deliver very good results in a fraction of the time of traditional development. And so this fast development in no-code platforms by non-technical users, we think that's the maximum level of business value you can get from one of these platforms, because most businesses can't afford to hire developers, or they can't even find them. We all know there's a shortage of traditional software developers, and the ones that are coming out of college, they want to go work at Google, not typically at a small company or even at a bank. And so as a small or medium company, you can use your existing staff as developers with a low-code platform. So where does the ROI of workflow automation come from? So this is based, again, on surveys. So a lot of it's employee time savings. Some of it's faster operations, meaning that if I turn around what my customer needs faster, then they're more likely to buy from us. If your sales quoting process is automated and you can get that quote to the customer in 5 minutes instead of the next day, then you close more business, and that leads to ROI. Cost savings, that can be from avoiding errors. So employee time saving is also kind of a cost savings, right? You're saving on labor, or you're freeing employees up to do something higher value. But on the cost saving side, when you avoid errors or you avoid compliance risk because you know that your process works right all the time, those savings can potentially be very huge. And I think that's actually a category that's often underestimated. I've definitely seen workflow automation projects where the bulk of the benefits came from avoiding errors and avoiding compliance risks rather than employee time savings, even though there's almost always some employee time savings involved as well. And so, that gets into the tangible benefits. So proper storage and routing of documents, don't underestimate that either. A lot of times there's compliance requirements around this. And if you're storing paper, typically you're paying some external company to come pick up boxes of paper once a month and store it in some warehouse where you never see it again because the regulations require you to do that. If that's online, then the information that's in those documents is much more accessible, and the cost of storing them is much lower. Eliminating errors, this is huge. Errors can be extremely costly in terms of lost business or even fines in some cases. And so avoiding errors is potentially a huge value. Integrations with external systems, that gives you the correct data in the right places for people to see it and act on it. And also, part of having the integration instead of manually copying data also helps avoid errors later on. Audit trail. So this avoids compliance risk. This avoids somebody later on saying that your contract's not valid or they didn't sign it or something like that. The audit trail is something that can avoid a lot of expenses later on. And then streamline contract management. If anybody's ever tried to revise a document with somebody outside of your company where you're emailing it back and forth and there's different versions with redlining, you know how important this can be, and airSlate has that built right in. So what to consider when choosing an automation tool? We talked about no code, but I'll mention this again. I think the first thing that you need to think about when choosing an automation tool is who is going to be doing the automation. Even though automation saves you a lot of time in the long term, it's not a one-time thing. You do have to typically tweak the automation later on as your business process changes. So if you're thinking, well, I can just hire some developers to go build this automation, or we're going to hire the professional services from the low-code company to build our automation, you need to think about your strategy for continuing to evolve that automation in the future. I'm not advocating that you become paralyzed by the idea that you're going to wring more efficiency out of the automation. It's more that as business changes, as regulations change, your automations need to change to match, because your automation is the business process. And so, thinking about no code and who's going to be able to build it, I think is the number one thing to consider. Next thing I'll advocate that you consider is the overall functionality. And here we'll pitch for airSlate a little bit again, because airSlate is sold as airSlate Business Cloud, which gives you an entire suite of products, not just airSlate on its own. The airSlate flows are pre-built templates that are available to get you started automating things in airSlate. We have US Legal, which is the largest online library of legal forms, PDF Filler, which is cloud-based PDF editing, and Sign Now, which is a standalone e-signature product that some of your users can use just to send out documents for signature in a very simple workflow. So while airSlate encompasses a lot of the functionality, including PDF editing and e-signature, those other products work great for standalone use cases as well. And so we think a lot of the value from airSlate comes from the suite of products in addition to the automation you get with airSlate. Workflow visualization. And so I think, most of the tools have some level of workflow diagram, but it's worth considering whether that diagram really captures your workflow use cases or not. With airSlate, you have this diagram that allows you to branch into conditional workflows. You can see all the steps in the workflow and track what work is assigned at each step very easily from the diagram. And then you can click into each one of these and configure it further as to who gets the step and what sort of message do they receive at the time the step is assigned to them. Also integrations. So airSlate has a huge bot library, which I've mentioned. A lot of workflow processes or workflow tools require you to integrate your processes using either code or connecting directly to the API, or some third-party tool like Zapier or Microsoft Power Automate. Those tools work pretty well, but having another tool in the box that you need to put together everything makes it harder. So airSlate has the integrations built right in. We're constantly adding to this library of bots, and anytime people have new needs for bots, you can let us know, and we often will add those bots to the library as well. So this library of integrations built right into airSlate is ever expanding. I mentioned Zapier, and Zapier is a way to kick off airSlate processes too. But we find that a lot of airSlate customers who already are using Zapier or using like Microsoft Power Automate, they don't need those tools, at least in the context of the things they're doing inside the airSlate product. And so we're saving people additional money on extra tools that they don't need for the integration part of the project. Data accuracy and security. So, this is a laundry list of some of the certifications or regulations that airSlate complies with. It's very important when you're choosing one of these tools to consider what regulatory regimes apply to the work that you're doing and whether the tools can support it. HIPAA in particular is one where if you're going to have any kind of patient data in your workflow platform, you need to know that that data is secured and encrypted in transit and at rest in the platform. And that's something that, that airSlate does provide. We've talked a lot about who no code is for. And so another really important element to choosing a platform is making sure that whoever it's for you're going to be able to get those people up and running and productive. Because the platform doesn't do anything on its own, right? It just sits there, it waits for you to configure your workflow. And so without somebody who understands the workflow to be able to input that and automate it, you really don't get anywhere. So airSlate's put a lot of investment into the airSlate Academy, which gives you the ability to completely free online enroll in courses to learn about how airSlate works, and also our other products, Sign Now, PDF Filler. And there's a very comprehensive set of courses to get you up and running and able to automate your own workflows. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Harry to give us a demo of the airSlate product.
Thanks,
And
Colin.
please, again, keep your questions coming in the Q&A panel, and we'll either answer them in writing or aloud.
Right, and yes, Tony, thank you for your questions. And at the end of this demo, I think I can answer a couple of those. But just to set the scene of what I hope to cover today. So first talking about what use case I'll kind of show, and this is a common use case in airSlate is, every company has their own requirements when onboarding employees. So employee onboarding is something that we see a lot of effort being put in to automate. So the use case of that employee onboarding, where traditionally a new employee, you sent them a packet of tax and onboarding forms. You need to collect information about them, where they live, maybe a t-shirt size if you're giving away swag, things that we all went through in our first week of employment at our jobs. So really the two people that are involved are the HR admin, who's responsible for tracking these documents down, making sure that they get the right signatures, but also the employee. We want to improve their experience, and instead of working through emails, and since we're all often working at home these days, do they have access to a printer where they can actually fill out and sign these documents? So I'll go ahead and share my screen, and what we'll take a look at first is my airSlate workspace. So this is the landing page when you log into airSlate. There's some information about kind of what's going on in my own workspace, some flow templates. You can see we have an employee onboarding flow for those that are working in a trial. You can also kind of use the work we already put together in order to kind of get jump started on some of these things. But I'm going to go ahead and create a new flow. So a flow is, you can think of that as a parallel to the process that we're automating. And that contains a few things. So first, we'll be brought to the template section. So a flow is made up of really three parts. The templates are the documents that are involved in our flow. What are the users interacting with, and those workflow steps? And that brings us to the workflow that Colin showed a preview of, where we can visually lay out the different people or personas that are interacting with this workflow and those documents. And then our bot section will come last, and that's really the automation workhorses, that no-code configuration to allow for passing information between documents from outside sources, like Colin mentioned, and we'll be leveraging those as well. So what I'm going to start with is, instead of uploading a form, I'm actually going to use our form or survey template type in order to create a simple web form to capture some top-level information from our HR admin to say, which employee are we sending this out to? So we'll go ahead and select a blank form. And this is kind of extending the use case of traditional e-signature workflows to allow for different ways of interacting with data and our end users. So we'll go ahead and name this form employee onboarding initiation. Initiation. And we'll give our HR admins that we're going to provide this to some gentle instructions. So use this form. So first, we want to just say which employee we're sending this to. So I'm going to go ahead and add a text field. You can either just click here and it will appear on the form next, or drag and drop. So simple. And we'll just get their first name and last name. So with every field that you're adding to these forms, either web forms or PDFs, which we'll show next, this data becomes actionable. So you can move this data to a Google Sheet, which we'll use here. So one thing we want to make sure is to provide some friendly names to each one of these fields so that we're make sure that when we want to use them later in either the workflow or our bot configuration, we know exactly which field we're referring to. We can also make this half a page just to keep it the form condensed for that HR admin who's going to be using this. And I'll just go ahead and use our copy tool to create the last name. So last name, name, and I'll also want to make sure that these are required. So these are things that we want to make sure that from our end user, we are capturing before they can move on to the next document. And lastly, I'm going to ask for the employee email, and make this required as well. So one great thing about airSlate is for the workflow, we don't need to know everyone who's involved before we kick it off. We can actually allow our end users to either input information or take information from an outside system of record in order to say, where does this need to route to next? So this looks good. I'm going to go ahead and click complete here, and that form will save against my flow, and we'll make sure we name this initiation form, and we'll rename the flow employee onboarding webinar. Perfect. So now everyone that has access to this flow understands what its stated end goal is. And next, we're going to add our classic tax form. So I'm going to go ahead and upload a document. You can also import. I have this W4 form that we've all kind of experienced or in some form or another. So now I've uploaded a PDF, and I can go into that PDF and actually start adding fillable fields to it. This one had some fillable fields existing on the document, but it's a similar experience to the web form where we're able to just click and drag anything on here. So if I wanted to say, add a new text field, it's as simple as clicking and dragging. Again, we can name it. So qualifying children. So if we wanted to make some actions and indicate whether it's required or not. So everything that's required is indicated with this nice arrow here. At any time, we can preview the end user experience of moving through the form. So that's also helpful as we're getting these set up. And for this address, perfect. So one thing that you'll note is this form has first and last name on it, but I'm also having the HR admin profile enter that information as well. So what we want to make sure is that for anywhere we can automate, we do. So when we get to the bot section, we'll take a look at how we can take the first and last name filled out by the HR admin of this new employee and already have this pre-filled on the form. Awesome. This looks good. My signature is required. So everything that's required from the end employee looks all right. So I'll go ahead and click complete. And now we'll be moving to setting up the workflow. So if I just restate who's involved in this, this first step is actually going to be an HR admin who will provide the flow, and really their responsibility is for filling out this initiation form. This is a simple use case, but you could capture more information here and use it later in the forms. And of course, we could extend this workflow to include any number of unique employee onboarding forms that my specific company has. So I've gone ahead and assigned the first, last name, and employee email fields in that initiation form to the HR admin. And since they're not going to actually fill out the W4, I'm going to actually just hide that document from them. So every document in a workflow, and as workflows get larger, not everyone has to interact with each document. We have the ability to control what their responsibility sets and what their visibility of those documents are. So for now, everything default should be great because this is always going to happen, and it will be the person who opens up this, what we call a slate, so every instance of the flow. And we can talk about that in a bit more detail later. So I'm going to go ahead and add another step. It's simple drag and drop, or click that plus button, and this will actually be the employee step. So I'll name that employee, and we want to configure this step to say, what is the employee responsible for doing, and who actually is the employee that we want to send this to. So similar to the HR admin where they didn't need to see the W4, the employee doesn't need to see that initiation form. but they are going to be responsible for all the fields on this actual W4 form. So we'll go ahead and use this handy assign all, assign that to the step, and we can see from this view kind of what in that W4 they are responsible for. For this step though, we're actually going to say, who is this default recipient? So you have the ability to type in the emails of people that are going to be sent to each of these steps, but we also, like I pointed out why we named those fields, have access to all the data that's happening within these documents for every instance that this flow is instantiated. So I'm going to use the data variable functionality and actually take from this initiation form that employee email. So now every time the HR admin completes their step of the flow and enters in that email, which is required, that will use the information that they inputted in order to say, who does this need to go to next? And this, of course, could be extended to more complicated use cases. We also can use that data in order to personalize the actual messaging that goes out. So in this case, I'm going to send an email, and let's go ahead and use the first name of that individual, and everything else will be kind of default and say who sent it to them and where they can what they can expect to be doing once they actually fill out that step. In this instance, when the previous step is completed, that's what this really means in so many words. But you can think of for more advanced workflows where, in the case of an employee is a senior level, maybe we need to get a signature or sign off for onboarding from the CEO. We could build out a bunch of conditions, and we're going to make sure that only this step is only executed if those conditions are met. Great. So before going to the bot section, I'm going to just show some other things that we'd want to integrate with. So in our case, we are a Google shop here at airSlate. So I've set up a Google sheet called Employee Onboarding, where I'm just going to take the information both from that first form that the HR admin is filling out, so keeping track of everyone that's going through this onboarding process, but also map over that address that the employee, because maybe we want to send them some a new coffee mug as soon as they get onboarded and fill out all their documents. So how we can do that is actually using our bots. So these are that no code automation. You can see by default, oftentimes we want to send an email upon completion. So we add that as a for you on every workflow. But I'll go ahead and first set up the bot in order to take the information from that web form and push the first and last name to the actual W4. So for that, and we have many bots, as Colin said, so depending on your system, and we may already have a bot, but we're also quick to add those. So I'll use this pre-fill doc-to-doc. So again, this is letting you take ownership of the data that's collected throughout the processes. And this, I want to take information from that initiation form, namely the first and last name, and move that to the W4. So on our W4 form, I do have the same name, so it knows what the names of those fields are, so I can map automatically. And I'll simply take the first and last name and move them to the next document. So we don't want to have people re-entering information that I've already captured during the flow. For bot execution conditions, so we're at this top part of the bot setup, I'm saying, what do I want this bot to do? Bot execution conditions really means, when do I want this to happen? And I want this to happen as soon as the information from the HR admin has been completely filled in. So I'll go ahead and set this up, and it's as simple as that to get one of these bots going. So that handles taking the information from my web form to my W4, but I also want to make sure that I insert the information once the employee is completed their W4 into this spreadsheet. And I'll also want to take their completed forms and move them into this Google Drive. I have an employee onboarding folder. So I'll go ahead and start with that Google Sheets bot. So if I use our handy search here, I can export to Google Sheets. So this is taking data from our documents and process and moving it into a Google Sheet. We also have pre-fill as well that you saw. So if you want to seed information. So I've connected this to my Google account. So now it has access to look at the different worksheets I have. And we'll type in webinar. And I'll go ahead and select that sheet. Perfect. So I don't need to match information. I'm not updating information, but we do have that capability here with match fields. But I just want to create a new row on that spreadsheet for every instance that this is complete. So I'll go ahead and take the first, last name, address from the W4. And it looks like I have address properly mapped. Other ones I can just click and show. But I also want to take from the initiation form their actual email. So I'll go ahead and take the employee email and go ahead and map this to the email column. So on the left side, everything that we're taking from our documents, and on the right side, the column headers of our Google Sheet. So now that I've said what I want the bot to do, I'll go ahead and update the bot execution conditions. And this will be pretty simple. I really want this to happen after the employee has signed and completed their W4. So I'll select the W4. I'll use my search field to get that signature of employee. And when that signature of the employee is signed and they've completed their document, this bot will execute and create a new row in my Google Sheet. And lastly, just to move that document into Google Drive, I'll use our Google Drive export bot. And this will allow me to take the actual completed documents as opposed to just those data points and move them into my employee onboarding folder. Perfect. So I'll go ahead and select that. One thing to point out here, of course, if you wanted all your employee onboarding to move into this folder, this works great, but we also allow you to use, just like for the emails and for workflow decisioning, any data points that you have. So say that for all employees joining the finance department, you want to move them to a specific folder, you could use that data once again to create or map to dynamic folders. So I'll go ahead and say I want to move both the W4 and our audit trail, so the certificate of completion, which ties the IP address and identifying information back to who interacted with those documents. And we'll say, similar to the Google Sheet, we want this to happen as soon as that signature is signed. Perfect. So I'll go ahead and apply setup. And now this workflow is ready to run. We'll have two steps in this process. One, the HR admin who wants to get this out and pre-fill some information. And secondly, the actual employee who's responsible for filling out that W4. Colin, before I jump into executing this workflow, were there any questions about anything I ran through so far?
No, I think that there's a couple of questions from Tony that I think we can come back to at the end.
Perfect.
Well, actually, you know what? I think Tony's number 2 question is probably a good time to answer that. So Tony asked us, is there any way to save the flow we've already done as a draft that we can use anytime later? So in the future, we just need to change necessary fields like the completion, emailing receipt, and signature party email without having to redo the field assignment, bots, and steps. So the flow is sort of a draft or a template. And each time you start the flow, you get a slate. And so the slates will all have different data in them. And the flow is defining what documents appear in the slate, what the steps are for the slate, and what bots will act on the slate. So again, the flow is the template. Each time you start it, you get a new slate. Now, in the one that we're looking at here, in Harry's example, we are using an email address that's entered on the first form to figure out who to send the second step to. And that's kind of a key piece. So if you're just changing stuff like who gets a completion email or who is the signature party each time, I would recommend a flow very similar to the one Harry created, where the first page of the flow, the first document in the flow, collects what are those emails. And then you can use bots and references like this one on the step to say, where do we use that email we collected to send this to a particular person? And so, yeah, I think what you're saying is the flow that you've already done, that is the draft or the template version. And then each time you start it, you can have different data that drives different behaviors of the slate.
Right. And if you do have you're using documents, I won't go into it in too much detail, but some workflows or some conditions of that flow contain different documents. We do allow for conditional documents. And if there's something where it's a similar flow, but maybe it's different documents and slightly different people involved in logic, it's easy enough to just duplicate a flow and work off of what you've already built for your first flow and reuse some elements in that second flow setup. Great. So now that everything is set up, I'll go ahead and get this flow instantiated. So go run through it as both personas, the HR admin and the end user employee. So there's a few different ways to get this kicked off. You can either assign it manually, so using emails, get it out to the right people, bulk send to a list, but I'm going ahead and use our shareable link. So once I enable this link is tied to this flow. So every time someone accesses it, maybe there's an internal HR team portal that you want to have this link for them to easily get these kicked off. This link will create a slate, like Colin mentioned, that instance of this workflow. So I'll go ahead and open this up and it will bring me into the workflow as that HR user. So we have a standard electronic record signature and dissent. You have control over that. And I'll enter in some information. So we'll use John Smith as our new employee. And so I get the email, type in that email. So from an HR admin perspective, my part of the workflow is done. I provided the employee name that I want to get this sent out to, so I can use that in later documents. I've said which email do I actually want this to get routed to. Awesome. So now, if we just take a look at what this looks like from a flow administrator point of view, you can see this is the flow that I just went through as an HR admin. Unknown users because I started it from a public link. So if I started this from within the platform, it would say Harry Radigan's employee onboarding webinar slate. And you can also control the name of these as well. So I just received an email. Bring it over here. So your company's branding logo is used in these emails, completely configurable. We're using that first name that we captured in that initiation form in order to personalize this email. And we'll go ahead and fill this out as the actual employee. All right. And now, since the employee didn't need to see that initiation onboarding, we hid that from them. And you can see that doc-to-doc bot moved the John Smith, all the information, all simple as it might be, in this use case to this PDF. So I'll fill out the rest of the information. We'll say 123 Main Street, and we'll say married. And I only have everything that's actually, we'll say unit 501. Everything that's actually required from the employee. We can see this guide on the right side, so it's easy enough to jump around. It also makes the sign-in experience, if they're doing this on a mobile device, maybe you emailed them, they open it up on their mobile phone. It allows for a kind of easy signing experience no matter what device someone is using. So I'll go ahead and add my signature. It guesses based on my email what my signature would be, but we'll go ahead and sign this as John Smith. And you can see we have different avenues of actually capturing the signature. And again, if you or your company prefers a simulated wet signature, you have the ability to kind of control which options your end users have for signing. So I should have made this a date field, missed that, but that's all right. Easy enough to change later. And we'll go ahead and click complete. Awesome. So now that was the setup and execution of the flow. One thing to point out is I actually missed it, meant to click before it showed up, but it was faster than I could click. So this new record in our Google Sheet was created. with the information from the W4 form and that initiation form combined. And we should see a new W4, that executed W4 in our Google Drive folder in the employee onboarding folder that we indicated. Great. So all in all, hopefully that kind of shows a quick way of getting your processes automated, a combination of our web form builder, our PDF editor, and fillable fields on the PDF, as well as how the workflow you can use to use the information you're capturing in the process, as well as set up rules to say when things are happening. And then again, using those bots to automate everything with only a one-time setup. So I will pause here, and I think we're going to move into the Q&A section.
Yeah, so let's cover Tony's other question first, which is there any way for the flow creator to not be able to see other flow creators' flows? Short answer is yes. So when you set up a flow, you can make it private or enable team access or not. And so when that flow is set as private, other flow creators cannot see it. So actually it's back on the previous screen here, I think, where the private toggle is. But so basically, there's multiple levels of both workspace-wide features as well as per flow features for different roles. So in the workspace, you can be the workspace owner who can really see and delete everything. You can also be a supervisor who has pretty similar privileges to the owner. But if you're just a flow creator, then you don't automatically get privileges to other flows. The flow creator privilege allows you to create your own new flows. And so again, if you create a flow and you make it private, other flow creators will not be able to see it. However, the workspace owner can still see it. So that's part of that. And the other thing is, I think, to your question, to Tony's question about saving a flow and reusing it, since the flow is reusable, it may be that what you want is for people to see the slates within a flow or not. So again, if you're the flow admin on a flow, you can see all of the slates inside that flow. If you have just the fill access to it, then you will not be able to see the other slates in that flow, only the ones that you created, unless you are also, again, the workspace owner, in which case you can see all the stuff no matter what your access to an individual flow is. So your access to a flow is a combination of your workspace-wide access and your flow-specific access that Harry's showing now. But a lot of different combinations are possible. And then, the short answer to the question is, yes, you can set flows to be private. Other people won't be able to see them unless they specifically have access. So that's the only question we have so far. Hopefully there's some other questions from the audience that we can answer for you at this time. All right, well, no more questions. So I guess at this point we can wrap it up, and hopefully everybody has access to contact me and Harry. Our email addresses are just colin@airslate.com and harry@airslate.com. So if you think of questions later, feel free to send us a note and we will get back to you. And with that, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Harry, for the great demo, and we will wrap it up.